Welcome. Today, we're sharing a story that stands out as one of the most unsettling events in Georgia's past. Let's go back to 1847. In Wilkes County, the Caldwell family owned a large cotton plantation, about 800 acres. Their estate sat on a hill and was known for its grand white column house with a wide porch, considered one of the finest homes in the area. The Caldwells were a well-known and wealthy family, but what got people talking were the twin daughters, Elizabeth and Catherine. The sisters looked so alike that even a small birthmark above their eyebrows was identical. That spring, they turned 22, an age by which most women of their class were already married. But there was more going on than anyone outside the plantation knew. Beneath the polished image of the Caldwell household, things were beginning to unravel. Documents found in 1952 during a courthouse renovation revealed that the twins' mother died giving birth to them. Their father, Thomas Caldwell, raised them on his own and never remarried. He focused entirely on building up his plantation and caring for his daughters. The first sign of something unusual came from a letter written by the family's longtime housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, to her sister in Savannah, dated April 8, 1847. The letter mentioned that the Caldwell sisters had been spending a lot of time in the quarters, referring to the slave quarters. She noted that Thomas didn't seem concerned, which she found odd. The letter, hidden inside the family Bible, wasn't found until many years later. The slave quarters were a group of small wooden houses, located about half a mile from the main home, behind a group of oak trees. The Caldwells had about 70 enslaved people working the fields and the house, fewer than some neighboring plantations, but still a sizable number. Two of those men, Samuel and Elijah, would soon become central figures in what followed. Historical records show they were purchased in 1842 from a struggling plantation in South Carolina. What made them different, according to later research, was that they had been secretly taught to read and write by the children of their previous owners. They hid this knowledge after arriving at the Caldwell estate, but not for long. One evening in late 1846, Catherine reportedly found Samuel reading a discarded newspaper in stables. Instead of telling anyone, she began secretly meeting with him. This detail came to light through Catherine's personal diary, discovered in 1964, when the old plantation house was torn down. Her diary entries around this time grew more vague, referring to Sis and our shared understanding. Shortly afterward, Samuel was moved from working in the fields to the stables, closer to the main house. While there's no official record confirming it, many believe that Elizabeth also formed connection with Elijah, who worked in the estate's gardens. The idea that both sisters had secret relationships with two enslaved men created a situation locals later described as a strange mirror of forbidden love. That winter in Georgia was unusually cold. Roads were blocked, and supplies were damaged. Isolation grew, and during those cold months, the bonds between the sisters and the two men seemed to grow stronger. In a letter from Thomas Caldwell to his brother dated January 23, 1847, he mentioned being worried. Elizabeth had become withdrawn, while Catherine seemed overly excited. He blamed the weather for their change in behavior. What he didn't realize was that both daughters were deeply involved in risky, hidden relationships that defied all the rules of their world. If discovered, these relationships would have brought severe consequences. The two men could have faced violence or death, and the Caldwell family's name would have been ruined. Clear evidence of these secret relationships came from notes tucked into a book of poetry that belonged to Elizabeth. These scraps of paper, dated February 1847, showed meeting plans and emotional messages. One note read, "The usual place at midnight. The moon will be new offering cover. He says C and S will join, for hearts beating as two." This note confirmed that the sisters weren't just aware of each other's actions. They were planning everything together. Being identical may have even helped them avoid suspicion. Everything changed on March 15th, 1847. That night, Thomas Caldwell told his daughters he had arranged for them to marry the sons of wealthy neighboring plantation owners. Catherine wrote in her diary that she kept calm on the outside, but felt like her heart had turned to stone. Elizabeth's reaction wasn't written down, but the events that followed made it clear she felt the same way. Early in the morning on March 18th, The plantation's overseer, James Whitaker, woke up to a strange noise. He found a small fire burning in one of the storage buildings near the slave quarters. The fire was quickly put out, but during confusion, something much more serious was discovered. Samuel, Elijah, and the Caldwell sisters were gone. Search teams were quickly organized. Nearby plantations were contacted, and groups were sent down every road and trail leaving the estate. At first, the assumption was that the two men had escaped and taken the sisters with them. A large reward was offered, and what followed became one of the biggest searches in local history. Thomas Caldwell was devastated. Witnesses said he barely slept or ate. But what the searchers didn't know, and what wouldn't be revealed until many years later, was that the fire was a distraction started by Elizabeth herself. In 1868, a former house servant named Ruth shared this detail with journalists who was collecting stories from the pre-Civil War South. Ruth said Elizabeth had told her what was going to happen and asked her not to say a word. The search stretched on for weeks, eventually going into other counties and even crossing state lines. Meanwhile, Thomas Caldwell's health got worse. By April, he was bedridden. Records show he was cared for by a longtime servant and visited by a doctor from Augusta. Then, on May 2nd, 1847, a letter arrived at the estate. What exactly was in it has never been made public. But whatever it said caused Thomas to react with extreme anger. He collapsed shortly after and died 3 days later. His death was recorded as apoplexy, which we now call a stroke. After Thomas Caldwell's death, his brother Edward took over the plantation. He came down from Charleston to settle things and manage the estate. While going through Thomas's personal papers, Edward came across something unexpected in his late brother's study, a small wooden box. Inside the box were what looked like marriage documents. Though roughly made, they included signatures that claimed Elizabeth had married Elijah and Catherine had married Samuel, both on the night of March 17, 1847. Alongside these papers was a letter believed to be written by Catherine. In the letter, Catherine explained that she and her sister had fallen in love with the two men. Knowing their father would never allow such relationships, they had quietly prepared to run away. They'd been gathering supplies and planning for months, hoping to reach a northern state where they could live in peace, even if they had to hide who they really were. The letter made it clear. The twins had not been taken by force. They left on purpose, leaving behind their wealth, family name, and everything familiar for a life they truly wanted. Catherine ended the letter with a wish that their father could one day forgive them, though she admitted that was unlikely. After speaking with lawyers and family members, Edward made a decision that would shape how this story would be told for generations. He hid the truth. The documents and letter were sealed back inside the box, and the public was told the same story. The Caldwell sisters had been kidnapped, possibly even killed, by escaped slaves. From then on, the search shifted to looking for remains instead of people. That version of the story stayed in place for nearly 20 years. But everything changed in 1865, after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. A woman showed up at the now-shrinking Caldwell estate, which had lost much of its land and value. She said her name was Margaret Johnson, but her face strongly resembled the missing Caldwell twins. She asked to speak with Edward, who still lived on the property. Witnesses said the meeting lasted for hours, and voices could sometimes be heard from behind the closed doors. When it ended, Edward looked shaken. He didn't speak about the visit, but soon began selling off the remaining parts of the estate. Within 6 months, the plantation was gone, and Edward moved back to Charleston, where he lived quietly until he died in 1871. The real story behind that meeting didn't come out until 1958, when Edward's granddaughter donated some family letters to the Georgia Historical Society. One of them, written by Edward to his wife, gave a detailed account of what happened. The woman who visited him was Catherine Caldwell, now going by Margaret Johnson. Her husband, Samuel, had changed his last name to Johnson after they escaped. Catherine explained that she, her sister, and the two men had successfully made it to Philadelphia. There, they found support from abolitionists and others in the free black community. They took on new names and started over. Elizabeth and Elijah, now calling themselves the Davis family, moved to Boston, where Elijah found work as a carpenter. Samuel opened a small horse stable, and Catherine worked as a seamstress. Both couples had children and raised them without ever revealing their real family history. Catherine had returned only to retrieve a few of her late mother's belongings and, more importantly, to set the record straight. She wanted it known that she and her sister were never victims. They had made their own decision, a risky, dangerous one, to live life on their own terms, despite the harsh laws and social rules they grew up under. But Edward refused to change the story. In his letter, he admitted he couldn't face the public shame or dishonor it would bring to the family name, or to his brother's memory. He offered Catherine a large sum of money on the condition that she stays silent and never come back to Georgia. There's no official record of whether she accepted, but records show that Margaret Johnson bought a train ticket to Philadelphia the next day and never returned. The tale of the twins being kidnapped and likely killed remained the accepted version. Then, in 1883, a fire destroyed most of the old courthouse in Wilkes County, including important records from before the war. That loss buried the truth even deeper. By the early 1900s, the story had taken on a life of its own, retold with added mystery and even ghost stories. But at the heart of it was something very real. Two sisters who made a bold and deeply personal choice. Then in 1964, during the demolition of the original Caldwell home, something important was found hidden in a wall of Catherine's old bedroom, her diary. It covered the year leading up to their disappearance, from January 1846 to March 1847. In it, Catherine shared her thoughts, doubts, and the growing emotional connection she felt with Samuel. She described how stunned she was to learn he could read and write, and how their conversations about religion, freedom, and the meaning of life slowly opened her eyes. She came to see the injustice around her not just as wrong, but as personal. One entry from November 12, 1846 read, "I have been blind, not only to the suffering around me, but to what it means to be fully human. S has opened my eyes, and now I cannot close them, even though the light sometimes hurts." The diary also confirmed that both sisters knew about each other's relationships and supported one another. They talked late into the night, made plans, and worried about what might happen. The final entry, dated March 16, 1847, simply said, "Tomorrow we leave everything we have known for an uncertain future. We may find freedom or death, but either is better than living a lie." The discovery of the diary renewed interest among historians studying life in the South before the Civil War. New research uncovered more evidence. Records showed 4 people booked passage from Savannah to Philadelphia in late March 1847, using the names Johnson and Davis. The 1850 census in Philadelphia listed Samuel and Catherine Johnson, identified as mulatto, living in a black neighborhood with their 2 children. Similar records in Boston showed Elijah and Elizabeth Davis, also listed as mulatto, living with 1 child. One of the most incredible finds came in 1968. A descendant of Elizabeth and Elijah, now a college professor in New England, got in touch after learning about the story. He had saved a collection of letters between the sisters, written throughout the 1850s and 60s. These letters showed that, despite everything they gave up, both women found meaning in the lives they built. They wrote about their children, their work, and their growing involvement in the abolitionist movement. They continued studying and learning, but they also feared being discovered, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made things even more dangerous. One letter stood out, dated July 4, 1865, just after the Civil War ended. It captured Catherine's thoughts on everything they had been through. July 4th, 1865, marked more than just Independence Day. For Catherine Caldwell, it symbolized personal freedom at last. After 18 years of living in secrecy, constantly on guard, she finally felt safe enough to stop hiding. Though challenges still lay ahead, she could now live openly. In a letter, she reflected on her father, wondering if, freed from the strict beliefs he once held, he might finally understand the decision she and her sister had made. By 1969, researchers had gathered enough evidence to completely change how the so-called Caldwell twins incident was understood. What had long been told as a story of kidnapping and assumed murder turned out to be something very different. the conscious choice of two young women to reject the world they were born into. Instead of clinging to wealth and social status, they chose love and principle. Their descendants, now spread across the northern U.S., have mostly kept their lives private. A few gave limited interviews to historians in the 1970s. Those interviews revealed that many family members grew up hearing edited versions of their history. Stories that said their great-grandmothers were northern women who married mixed-race men. The full truth, that they were daughters of a Georgia plantation owner who had secretly married enslaved men and escaped north, was sometimes only shared once the children were grown or not at all. Some descendants felt pride in their ancestors' courage. Others wrestled with the fact that their family history included both ties to slavery and rebellion against it. Today, almost nothing remains of the original Caldwell plantation. The land has been divided and developed, and only a small historical sign, put up in 1972, marks the spot near where the main house once stood. That marker briefly mentions the Caldwell family, but says nothing about the sisters or their bold escape. Over time, local views have shifted, from disbelief and denial to a deeper understanding of how unusual and important their story really was. Historians have taken a strong interest in the case, especially those who study resistance to slavery and interracial relationships in the pre-Civil War South. What continues to make this story powerful is how it pushes back against simplified views of the past. It shows that even those born into privilege could come to question the system they benefited from. It also shows how deeply personal relationships could cut through the barriers of race and status, though doing so came at great risk. In one entry from her diary, Catherine wrote, "We didn't choose to be born into this world of masters and slaves, but we can choose whether or not to accept it. By choosing a different path, she and Elizabeth left behind a legacy, not one built on wealth or fame, but on the rare courage it takes to live by your conscience, no matter the cost." One of the most unsettling aspects of her story is how quickly and thoroughly the truth was buried. The public was left with a version shaped by those who stayed behind. It makes you wonder how many other stories like this were lost, acts of quiet rebellion, that never made it into the history books. What we know about Elizabeth, Catherine, Samuel, and Elijah comes mostly in fragments: old letters, diary pages, census records, documents that confirm they existed, but tell us little about their daily lives, their thoughts, or their dreams. Still, we can imagine the bravery it took to walk away from everything they knew and take a chance on something real. The Caldwell home is gone. The fields where Samuel and Elijah once worked have changed with time and development. What remains is a story, preserved not in statues or plaques, but in archives and family memories. A story that still asks difficult questions and refuses to fade away. And what about that wooden box with the hand-drawn marriage certificates, the proof of their secret unions? Its current location is unknown. Some believe Edward Caldwell destroyed it, unable to live with what it represented. Others think it might still be out there, tucked away in an attic or archive, waiting to be found again, just like the truth it held. The search for that truth isn't just for historians. It's for anyone trying to understand the full complexity of our past. The story of the Caldwell twins is a powerful reminder that history isn't just about battles and politics. It's about people, their values, their choices, and the quiet acts of courage that sometimes change everything. Then, in 1966, another remarkable piece of the puzzle surfaced. During an estate sale in Philadelphia, someone bought an old writing desk. Hidden inside a secret drawer was a small leather-bound journal. It was water-damaged, but still readable, and it had belonged to Samuel Johnson, formerly known as Samuel from the Caldwell plantation. His journal covered the years 1848 to 1859, offering the first-hand account from one of the men who escaped. In it, Samuel described how carefully they planned their escape, gathering supplies, studying maps, memorizing routes tied to the Underground Railroad. He described the journey north as a brutal 6-week trek. They traveled by night, hid during the day, and relied on strangers who risked everything to help them. In one entry from April 2nd, 1847, he wrote about a near miss. A patrol stopped the wagon they were hiding in. Elizabeth, terrified but calm, convinced the patrolman she was just visiting relatives. Samuel recalled Catherine shaking beside him as they waited in silence. His writings also revealed the emotional weight of their choice. He felt guilt for leaving behind others still enslaved. Freedom brought not only relief, but confusion and fear. Adjusting to life in Philadelphia meant staying alert at all times. He also wrote tenderly about his bond with Catherine. In an 1852 entry, he said, "She sometimes speaks of what she gave up to be with me. I remind her I know exactly what she gave up, maybe more than she does. Some days I see her watching other women pass by, dressed in silk. I wonder if she regrets it. But then she turns to me, and I see the same strength in her eyes that brought us here." The journal also confirmed that they didn't cut all ties to Georgia. Catherine stayed in touch with Margaret Sullivan, the family's longtime housekeeper, the same woman who had noticed the sisters' unusual behavior in a letter years before. After moving to Richmond, Margaret quietly kept Catherine informed about events at home, including her father's death and her uncle Edward taking over the plantation. It was this information that eventually led Catherine to return to Georgia in 1865 for the last time. Samuel once described Catherine's return to Georgia in 1865 as reckless, but something she needed to do for her own peace of mind. When she came back from that journey, he could tell it hadn't given her the closure she was hoping for. In his journal, he wrote that she returned more burdened than before, carrying the pain of her father's final days. The idea that he died believing she'd been kidnapped, maybe even killed, was something she couldn't shake, and no amount of comfort could ease that guilt. Then, in 1967, researchers uncovered more important clues while digging into local church records. A small African Methodist Episcopal church in Philadelphia had documented the baptisms of both the Johnson and Davis children. The records showed that Elizabeth was a godmother to Catherine's first son, and Catherine was a godmother to Elizabeth's daughter. Clear proof that the sisters remained close, even as they built separate lives. The records also show that both families moved often, about every 2 years, throughout the 1850s. The likely reason? Fear. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made the danger of being captured very real again, even in free states. So, they stayed cautious, always watching, always moving. By 1855, tax and city records confirmed that Samuel Johnson had built a modest but steady livery business in a mostly immigrant neighborhood in Philadelphia. That success allowed his family to buy a small home, an incredible achievement for a man who had once been enslaved. Around the same time, Elizabeth and Elijah had moved to a quiet farming town in western Massachusetts. Elijah worked as a carpenter and furniture maker. Elizabeth taught reading and basic math to local children, helping bring in extra income. Their choice to live in a rural area may have been strategic. Far from cities, they were less likely to draw unwanted attention. In 1968, yet another piece of the story surfaced. A researcher studying old abolitionist newspapers found that both sisters had secretly contributed to anti-slavery publications between 1852 and 1858. They had written under aliases, describing the emotional and moral costs of slavery, not only for those enslaved, but for those who owned them. One letter, likely written by Elizabeth, described slavery as a force that damaged everyone involved. It poisons the soul of the master, just as it breaks the body of the slave. It makes true human connection impossible behind walls built from power and fear. During the Civil War, Samuel wrote often about the impact of the conflict on their lives. He donated to Union efforts, attended meetings, and, like many free black families in the North, feared what might happen if the South won. After the Emancipation Proclamation, he wrote, "Today begins what we have dreamed of for so long. No one has the right to own another." He and Catherine marked the day quietly, unable to fully express what it meant to those who had lived both sides of slavery. After the war, life was legally safer, but the families remained cautious, rarely speaking of their past. In 1873, Samuel died of pneumonia. His death certificate listed him only as a business owner, with no mention of his remarkable life. Catherine never remarried. She ran the business with her son, then moved to upstate New York, where she died in 1890. Elizabeth passed away in 1900 in Massachusetts, surrounded by her family. In her later years, she carefully edited her stories of Georgia, leaving out the most dangerous truths. A letter Elizabeth wrote in 1895 their granddaughter, offered this wisdom. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. No comfort is worth the cost of losing your soul. No known photos of the sisters survive. But in 1969, archaeologists at the former Caldwell plantation found the foundations of the slave quarters and a small wooden bird, a gift from Samuel mentioned in Catherine's diary. In 2002, another artifact surfaced, a locket with miniature portraits labeled Elizabeth and Catherine, Georgia, 1844. Likely hidden before Catherine's return to Georgia, it was perhaps a quiet act of insurance in case she didn't survive. The Caldwell twins story remains relatively unknown, perhaps because it challenges easy narratives, showing not just interracial love, but white Southern women choosing to reject the system they were raised in. Their descendants live across the country today. Some know the story, many do not, but their legacy isn't in monuments. It's in the courage to act, to leave behind comfort for truth. As Catherine wrote before their escape, we step into darkness, not knowing if we'll find light, but even uncertainty is better than living a lie. That moment, still echoing, asks us all what we're willing to risk to live by our values.